The morning mist clung to the towering pines of British Columbia's Whistler Provincial Forest like a shroud, swallowing sounds and distorting shadows. It was September 15th, 2009, and what began as a simple father-son camping expedition would become one of Canada's most baffling disappearances. Two men entered those woods with enough supplies for a week. They never came out. For 15 years, their vanishing remained an unsolved mystery that haunted investigators, devastated a family, and spawned countless theories. Then, on a routine logging operation deep in the wilderness, a worker's chainsaw bit into something that wasn't wood. What he uncovered would shatter everything everyone thought they knew about what happened in those mountains. Michael Hartwell adjusted his rearview mirror one last time, watching his modest Vancouver home disappear behind the morning fog. At 42, he was a man who lived by routines, insurance adjuster by day, weekend warrior by choice. But this wasn't just another weekend trip. This was special. Beside him, 17-year-old Connor bounced his leg with nervous energy, earbuds dangling around his neck, smartphone clutched in his palm. The kid had been reluctant about this whole camping thing, preferring his video games and social media to the great outdoors. But Michael was determined to bridge the growing gap between them before Connor headed off to university next year. The drive north took them through winding mountain roads that carved through dense forest. Michael tried making conversation, pointing out landmarks, sharing stories from his own youth spent exploring these very mountains with his father. Connor offered polite nods and brief responses, his attention drifting between the passing scenery and his phone's dwindling signal bars. As they climbed higher into the wilderness, civilization began to fade away. The last gas station, the last cell tower, the last chance to turn back. Their destination was a remote campsite near Glacier Lake, accessible only by a narrow logging road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. Michael had discovered this spot during his own teenage adventures and had been planning to share it with Connor for months. It was pristine, untouched, the kind of place where you could hear your own heartbeat in the silence. The perfect location for a father and son to reconnect away from the distractions of modern life. They arrived at the trailhead just after noon, their silver Honda Civic looking oddly out of place among the towering Douglas firs. Michael had packed meticulously. Tent, sleeping bags rated for mountain weather, cooking supplies, enough food for a week even though they planned to state in being prepared. Connor only 4 days. He believed shouldered his significantly lighter pack with the grudging acceptance of a teenager honoring a parental obligation. The hike to their campsite would take roughly 3 hours through terrain that ranged from gentle forest paths to steep rocky climbs. Michael led the way, occasionally stopping to point out wildlife tracks or interesting geological formations. Connor followed, his initial complaints about the weight of his pack gradually giving way to genuine curiosity about their surroundings. By the time they reached Glacier Lake, even Connor had to admit the view was incredible. The lake stretched out before them like a mirror, reflecting the snow-capped peaks that surrounded it. Their campsite sat on a small peninsula that jutted into the crystal-clear water, providing panoramic views in every direction. Michael began setting up their tent while Connor explored the shoreline, skipping stones and testing the water temperature with his hand. For the first time in months, they were having an actual conversation. No arguments about grades or curfews or college applications, just a father and son enjoying each other's company in one of nature's most beautiful settings. That first evening passed peacefully. They cooked dinner over a campfire, shared stories, and watched the stars emerge in numbers impossible to see from the city. Connor even put his phone away voluntarily, admitting that the lack of signal was actually liberating. Michael felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. This trip was already succeeding beyond his hopes. The next morning brought clear skies and the promise of adventure. They planned to hike to a series of waterfalls, deeper in the wilderness, following old game trails that Michael remembered from his youth. They packed light for the day hike, leaving most of their gear at the campsite. Connor seemed genuinely excited, asking questions about the route and the wildlife they might encounter. The transformation from sullen teenager to engaged companion was remarkable. But something strange happened as they ventured deeper into the forest. The well-defined trails began to fade, becoming increasingly difficult to follow. Michael, who prided himself on his navigation skills, found himself consulting his compass more frequently. The terrain looked different than he remembered. More overgrown, more confusing. Trees that should have served as landmarks seemed to have moved or disappeared entirely. By mid-afternoon they were lost. Michael tried to maintain his composure, not wanting to alarm Connor, but the reality of their situation was becoming undeniable. They had been walking for hours without finding any of the familiar markers he remembered. The waterfall they were seeking remained elusive. Even more concerning, the path back to their campsite was no longer clear. Every direction looked the same. Dense forest stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the occasional rocky outcrop or small clearing. Connor noticed his father's growing anxiety despite Michael's efforts to hide it. The easy conversation of the morning gave way to tense silence as they pushed through increasingly thick undergrowth. Michael's careful pace became more urgent, more desperate. He was a man accustomed to solving problems, to finding solutions, but the forest seemed to be actively working against them. As evening approached, they were forced to accept a harsh truth. They would not be making it back to their campsite that night. Michael tried to make the best of the situation, setting up a makeshift shelter using branches and their emergency tarp. They rationed their limited supplies, sharing a single energy bar and sipping water sparingly. Connor handled the situation with surprising maturity, helping gather firewood and asking practical questions about their next move. They spent a restless night huddled together, taking turns feeding their small fire. Strange sounds echoed through the darkness. Branches cracking. Something large moving through the underbrush. The haunting call of an owl that seemed to come from multiple directions. Michael reassured Connor that these were normal forest sounds, but privately he felt an unease that went beyond simple concern about being lost. Dawn brought renewed hope and determination. Michael was confident they could retrace their steps, find their way back to the lake, and salvage the remainder of their trip. They broke camp early, carefully marking their path to avoid walking in circles. But as the hours passed, their situation only seemed to worsen. The forest grew denser, the terrain more challenging, the landmarks more confusing. By the third day, their water was running dangerously low. They had found a small stream the previous evening, but Michael was hesitant to drink from it without proper purification tablets, which were back at their main campsite. Connor was beginning to show signs of dehydration and exhaustion. The initial adventure had transformed into a survival situation. Michael made increasingly desperate attempts to find their way out. He climbed trees trying to spot the lake or any recognizable feature. He built signal fires hoping to attract attention from aircraft. He even tried to follow what looked like old trails, only to have them disappear into impenetrable thickets. Each failed attempt deepened his growing panic and self-recrimination. Meanwhile, back in Vancouver, Michael's ex-wife Sarah was becoming increasingly worried. The divorce had been amicable, focused on what was best for Connor, but she still cared deeply about Michael's well-being. When he failed to return Connor by Sunday evening as promised, she initially assumed they had simply lost track of time. Men and their camping trips, she thought with familiar exasperation. But when Monday morning arrived with no word from either of them, Sarah's concern transformed into genuine alarm. Michael was nothing if not reliable. He never missed work without calling. He never broke promises about Connor's schedule. This wasn't like him at all. She tried calling his cell phone repeatedly, but every attempt went straight to voicemail. His cheerful recorded greeting began to sound increasingly ominous with each repetition. Sarah contacted Michael's office, hoping he had simply forgotten to update her about extended plans. But his colleagues were equally puzzled. Michael had no meetings scheduled beyond Monday. His desk showed no signs of preparation for an extended absence. His secretary mentioned that he had seemed excited about the camping trip, but had given no indication it would last longer than planned. By Tuesday morning, Sarah was making phone calls to every authority she could think of: park services, local police, search and rescue organizations. The challenge was that she had only a vague idea of where they had gone. Michael had mentioned Whistler Provincial Forest and something about a lake, but the region contained dozens of lakes and hundreds of square miles of wilderness. The initial search efforts were hampered by the vast area that needed to be covered and the remote nature of their suspected location. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the forest, but the dense canopy made spotting anything from the air nearly impossible. Ground teams focused on established trails and popular camping areas, but Michael and Connor had ventured far from the beaten path. Their silver Honda Civic was discovered on Wednesday morning, parked exactly where Michael had left it at the remote trailhead. The vehicle was unlocked, keys still in the ignition, just as Michael always did when camping in areas he considered safe. Inside, investigators found nothing unusual. No signs of struggle, no indication of foul play. Connor's extra clothes were still folded neatly in his duffel bag. Michael's detailed camping checklist lay on the dashboard, every item marked off with his characteristic precision. Search dogs were brought in immediately. The German shepherds picked up the scent trail within minutes, following it confidently along what appeared to be the route Michael and Connor had taken toward the lake. The dogs led search teams through increasingly difficult terrain, their handlers struggling to keep pace through dense undergrowth and overfallen logs. But after roughly 6 miles, something strange happened. The dogs stopped. They circled, whined, and completely lost the trail. "That's not normal behavior," explained veteran search dog handler Rebecca Walsh. "These animals can track scents for days, even through rain. But it was like the trail just vanished into thin air. The weather had been clear since Michael and Connor's departure. There was no reason for the scent to disappear so completely. Ground search teams expanded their efforts, covering a radius of 20 miles from the abandoned vehicle. Volunteers from local hiking clubs joined the official rescue personnel. Michael's co-workers took time off to help comb through the wilderness. Even Connor's friends from high school showed up, many of them experiencing their first real taste of the forest's unforgiving nature. The terrain was brutal. Steep ravines carved by centuries of snowmelt created natural barriers that could easily trap or injure hikers. Dense stands of old-growth timber blocked out sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight that made navigation treacherous. Rocky outcroppings and unstable scree slopes posed constant dangers, and everywhere the forest seemed to close in on itself, paths disappearing, landmarks shifting, directions becoming meaningless. Aviation units flew countless hours over the search area. Experienced pilots who knew every ridge and valley of the region strained their eyes, looking for any sign of the missing campers. They searched for bright-colored camping gear, smoke from emergency fires, or any disturbance in the forest canopy that might indicate human presence. But the wilderness kept its secrets. As days turned into weeks, the official search efforts began to wind down. Resources were limited, and the chances of finding anyone alive after 2 weeks in the mountains were slim. The decision to scale back active searching was agonizing for everyone involved, but the reality of the situation could no longer be ignored. Sarah refused to accept defeat. She organized her own search parties, recruiting anyone willing to spend weekends scouring remote areas that the official teams might have missed. She studied topographical maps until she could navigate the region in her sleep. She learned to read weather patterns and animal behavior, becoming an expert in wilderness survival techniques she never thought she would need. Local newspapers covered the disappearance extensively in the first month. Television news crews filmed dramatic footage of search helicopters and interviewed tearful family members. But as leads dried up and other stories demanded attention, media coverage gradually faded. The missing father and son became just another tragic statistic in the long list of people who had vanished in Canada's vast wilderness. Michael's brother David flew in from Toronto to help coordinate the search efforts and provide support for Sarah. The two had always gotten along well, united in their concern for Connor's well-being even after the divorce. David was a practical man, an engineer who approached problems systematically. But even his methodical nature couldn't impose order on the chaos of the disappearance. Michael knew these mountains, David told reporters during one of the final press conferences. He'd been hiking here since he was Connor's age. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't the type to take unnecessary risks, especially with his son along. Something happened out there that we don't understand. The investigation into their personal lives revealed nothing suspicious. Michael's finances were stable. His relationship with Sarah, while ended romantically, remained cordial and focused on co-parenting. Connor was a typical teenager with typical teenage problems, but nothing that would suggest he might run away. Both had been looking forward to the camping trip, according to friends and family members. Private investigators were hired and dismissed when they produced no new leads. Psychics and dowsers offered their services, claiming they could locate the missing pair through supernatural means. Sarah, desperate for any hope, entertained some of these offers before recognizing them as cruel exploitation of her grief. The first anniversary of the disappearance brought renewed media attention and fresh search efforts. New volunteers joined the cause, and advances in search technology provided tools that hadn't been available the previous year. Thermal imaging equipment was deployed from aircraft. Ground-penetrating radar was used in areas where the men might have taken shelter. Sonar equipment swept the depths of every accessible lake and pond. Nothing was found. Connor's 18th birthday passed unmarked, except by his mother's private vigil. The day he should have graduated from high school came and went in silence. College acceptance letters arrived at the house where he would never return to read them. His bedroom remained exactly as he had left it that September morning, a shrine to a life interrupted. Sarah's friends and family urged her to move on, to accept what had happened, and try to rebuild her life. Some suggested grief counseling or support groups for families of missing persons. But Sarah couldn't let go. Every unexplained noise in the night might be Connor returning home. Every phone call from an unknown number might be Michael explaining where they had been. Hope, she discovered, was both a blessing and a curse. The second year brought fewer volunteers and less attention. The story had grown cold in the public consciousness, replaced by newer tragedies and more recent mysteries. But Sarah continued her solitary searches, driving to the mountains every weekend with fresh supplies and renewed determination. She had become an expert tracker herself, learning to read sign that most people would never notice. Local indigenous elders, when approached respectfully, shared stories about that particular region of the forest. Some areas were considered sacred, they explained. Others were said to be places where people could become lost in ways that defied normal understanding. These weren't necessarily supernatural explanations, but rather acknowledgments that the wilderness contained forces and patterns beyond conventional comprehension. The forest has its own spirit, explained Agnes Clearwater, a respected elder from the local First Nation. Sometimes it calls people deeper than they intended to go. Sometimes it keeps them longer than they planned to stay. We have always known this, but others often don't listen until it's too late. By the third year, even Sarah's most dedicated supporters began to worry about her mental health. She had lost weight and aged dramatically. Her job performance suffered as she spent more and more time researching disappearance cases and wilderness survival techniques. She joined online forums dedicated to missing persons cases, finding both comfort and obsession in connecting with others who understood her situation. The official status of the case remained open but inactive. New leads were investigated when they arose, but they invariably led nowhere. Hikers would occasionally report finding pieces of clothing or camping equipment in the forest, but none ever proved to be connected to Michael and Connor. The wilderness was full of abandoned gear from decades of outdoor recreation. Insurance companies eventually processed death certificates based on the presumption of accidental death. Sarah used the payouts to fund continued search efforts and to establish a scholarship in Connor's name for students planning to study environmental science. The money felt like blood money to her, payment for losses she refused to acknowledge. As years passed, the case joined the ranks of regional legends and cautionary tales. Experienced hikers would mention the Hartwell disappearance when discussing wilderness safety with newcomers. The story served as a reminder of how quickly the mountains could claim even experienced outdoors people. But for those who had known Michael and Connor personally, it remained an open wound that refused to heal. The forest kept its secrets, and time moved on. New missing person cases demanded attention and resources. New families joined the ranks of those searching for answers that might never come. The wilderness continued its ancient patterns, indifferent to human tragedy and human hope alike. But deep in those same mountains, something waited. Something that would eventually be found by a man with a chainsaw who was just trying to do his job. Something that would rewrite everything anyone thought they knew about what had happened to Michael and Connor Hartwell on that September morning 15 years earlier. The logging truck rumbled along the narrow forest road, its massive tires churning up clouds of dust that hung in the still morning air. Jake Morrison had been working these mountains for over 20 years, and he thought he'd seen everything the wilderness had to offer. At 53, he was one of the most experienced loggers in the region, known for his ability to navigate terrain that would challenge younger men. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel as he guided the heavy machinery toward a stand of mature pines marked for selective harvesting. The work was routine: identify the designated trees, calculate the safest direction for them to fall, make the cuts with surgical precision. Jake took pride in his craft, understanding that proper logging required both strength and finesse. He wasn't one of those operators who just pointed and cut. He read the forest like a book, understanding the subtle signs that indicated which trees were ready for harvest and which should be left to grow. This particular section of Whistler Provincial Forest had been scheduled for thinning operations for months. Environmental assessments had been completed, permits secured, access roads cleared. The work would help reduce fire hazards while allowing younger trees more room to flourish. It was conservation through careful management, the kind of sustainable forestry that Jake believed in. But as he began his survey of the designated area, something caught his attention. About 200 yards off the main cutting zone, partially hidden by decades of undergrowth, he spotted what looked like artificial coloring. Not the browns and greens of natural forest, but something synthetic, bright blue fabric that didn't belong in the wilderness. Jake shut off his equipment and approached on foot, pushing through thick brush that seemed determined to keep him away. The fabric turned out to be part of what had once been a high-quality camping tent, now weather-beaten and partially collapsed. But this wasn't just abandoned camping gear. The tent was surrounded by other items that told a story of extended habitation: a carefully constructed fire ring, food containers hung from branches to protect them from bears, a makeshift latrine dug at an appropriate distance from what had clearly been a long-term campsite. His first thought was that he'd stumbled upon someone's illegal camping operation. The area was far from any designated campgrounds, and extended stays in provincial forests required special permits. But as he looked more closely, something felt wrong about the scene. The gear was too old, too weathered. Some of it looked like it had been there for years, not weeks or months. Jake's trained eye began cataloging details that would later prove crucial to investigators. The tent was a high-end model, the kind serious backpackers invested in for extended wilderness trips. But it had been modified in ways that suggested desperate improvisation. Extra guy lines had been added using what looked like shoelaces. Patches covered tiers that had been repaired with duct tape and pieces of fabric from other sources. The fire ring showed signs of extensive use. Layers of ash and charcoal indicated countless fires had burned here over an extended period. But the construction was sophisticated, built by someone who understood fire safety and heat management. Rocks had been carefully selected and positioned to create an efficient burning chamber that would produce maximum heat with minimum smoke. What disturbed Jake most was the evidence of tool-making scattered around the campsite. Branches had been sharpened into spears using what appeared to be a knife, but also rocks and other improvised implements. Pieces of metal, possibly from camping equipment, had been fashioned into crude cutting tools. This wasn't the work of casual campers. This was the handiwork of people who had been forced to adapt, to survive using whatever materials they could find. Jake's pulse quickened as he began to understand what he was looking at. This wasn't an illegal campsite. This was a survival situation that had lasted far longer than anyone should have been able to endure in these mountains. Someone had lived here for months, possibly years, under conditions that would challenge even experienced survivalists. He pulled out his cell phone, grateful to find a weak signal in this remote location. The call to emergency services was brief and urgent. He provided GPS coordinates and a preliminary description of what he'd found, but he knew the words couldn't capture the full significance of his discovery. This wasn't just abandoned camping gear. This was evidence of human endurance pushed to its absolute limits. While waiting for authorities to arrive, Jake continued his careful examination of the site. He was experienced enough to know not to disturb potential evidence, but his curiosity was overwhelming. Near what appeared to be the tent's main entrance, he found something that made his blood run cold. Scratched into a piece of bark, barely visible after years of weather exposure, were two names, Michael and Connor. The implications hit him like a physical blow. Jake had lived in this region long enough to remember the massive search operation 15 years earlier. Every local resident had heard about the father and son who had vanished without a trace during what should have been a routine camping trip. The story had become part of regional folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers of venturing too far into unmarked wilderness. But if these names belonged to Michael and Connor Hartwell, then everything everyone thought they knew about their disappearance was wrong. They hadn't died in the first few days from exposure or accident. They had survived. They had adapted. They had built this remarkable shelter and lived in these mountains for an extended period that defied all conventional wisdom about wilderness survival. The sound of approaching helicopters interrupted Jake's racing thoughts. Within an hour, the remote campsite was swarming with investigators, forensic specialists, and search and rescue personnel. The scene was carefully photographed and documented before anyone was allowed to move anything. Every piece of equipment, every modification, every sign of human habitation was cataloged with meticulous attention to detail. Detective Maria Santos, now 15 years older, but still leading missing persons investigations for the regional police force, stood at the edge of the clearing and tried to process what she was seeing. She had worked the original Hartwell case, had interviewed family members, had coordinated search efforts that covered hundreds of square miles. The failure to find any trace of the missing pair had haunted her throughout her career. "This changes everything," she murmured to her partner, Detective Ryan Park. "If this is their campsite, then they survived the initial days we thought killed them. They were alive out here, possibly for months or even years." Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the forensic anthropologist who had been called to the scene, was already beginning her preliminary examination of the site. Her trained eye could read stories in the arrangement of objects, the wear patterns on tools, the sophisticated modifications to basic camping equipment. Whoever lived here understood wilderness survival at an advanced level, she explained to the assembled investigators. The fire management alone shows extensive knowledge of heat conservation and smoke dispersal. The food storage system is textbook perfect for bear country. The shelter modifications indicate they were preparing for long-term habitation, not temporary emergency shelter. But the most significant discovery was yet to come. Hidden beneath what appeared to be a carefully constructed cache, investigators found a waterproof container that had been buried near the campsite's perimeter. Inside was a collection of items that would rewrite the entire narrative of the Hartwell disappearance. The container held personal documents, including identification cards for both Michael and Connor Hartwell. But it also contained something far more valuable, a detailed journal written in Michael's distinctive handwriting. The leather-bound notebook contained entries spanning nearly 3 years, documenting their survival, their struggles, and ultimately their fate. The first entry was dated just 4 days after their disappearance and began with words that would haunt everyone who read them. "We found the campsite, but something is wrong here. This isn't where we meant to be, and I don't think we're alone in these mountains." As Detective Santos carefully turned the fragile pages, protected by evidence gloves, the true scope of the Hartwell mystery began to emerge. This wasn't just a story of survival against impossible odds. According to Michael's journal entries, they had encountered something in these mountains that challenged everything anyone understood about this wilderness area. The journal described their initial days after becoming lost, their growing desperation as familiar landmarks failed to materialize, their relief at finding this sheltered location near a reliable water source. But it also documented increasingly strange encounters that suggested they weren't the only humans in this remote region of the forest. "Day 12, read one entry. "Connor swears he saw lights moving through the trees last night. No flashlights, no campfires, just a steady glow that seemed to drift between the trunks like it was following the animal trails. I told him it was probably just his imagination, but I saw them too." Another entry, dated several weeks later, was even more disturbing. "Found evidence of other camps today. Old ones, but not ancient. Someone else has been living in these mountains, and they've been here a lot longer than we have. The question is whether they know about us, and whether they consider us a threat." The journal painted a picture of two people who had managed not just to survive, but to establish a sustainable existence in one of Canada's most challenging wilderness environments. Michael documented their daily routines, their successes and failures, their gradual adaptation to a lifestyle that bore no resemblance to their former urban existence. But threaded throughout the survival narrative was a growing sense of unease about their situation. References to the others became more frequent as the entries continued. Descriptions of disturbing discoveries, evidence of human presence that couldn't be explained by conventional understanding of who might be living in such remote areas. "Day 87, Michael had written, "Connor is changing. We both are. The isolation is getting to us, but it's more than that. Sometimes I catch him staring into the forest like he's listening to something I can't hear. When I ask him about it, he just says the mountains are calling to him. I don't know what that means, but it scares me." The later entries became increasingly erratic, both in handwriting and content. Michael's usually precise prose gave way to fragmentary observations and cryptic references that suggested his mental state was deteriorating under the strain of extended isolation. "Day 115. They came to the camp last night. Didn't see faces, didn't hear voices, but someone was definitely here. Nothing was taken, nothing was disturbed, but I know they were watching us. Connor says they've been watching us for weeks. He says they're waiting for something, but he won't tell me what." The final entries were the most disturbing of all. Michael's handwriting became shaky, almost frantic, as he described events that seemed to blur the line between reality and hallucination. But even accounting for possible psychological breakdown, the details were specific enough to suggest that something genuinely disturbing had occurred in those final weeks. Day 143. Connor is gone. Not lost, not taken, but gone by choice. He left in the middle of the night without saying goodbye, without taking any supplies. Just walked into the forest like he was going home. I tried to follow his tracks, but they disappeared after a few hundred yards. It's like the forest swallowed him up. The last entry was dated 3 days later and consisted of only a few lines. I understand now why Connor left. The mountains have been calling to me, too. I can hear them whispering in the wind, promising things I never knew I wanted. Maybe it's time to stop fighting and listen to what they're trying to tell me. Detective Santos closed the journal with trembling hands. She had investigated missing persons cases for over 20 years, but she had never encountered anything quite like this. The journal suggested that Michael and Connor Hartwell had not only survived in the wilderness far longer than anyone thought possible, but that their ultimate fate might be connected to something even more mysterious than simple survival gone wrong. The physical evidence at the campsite supported much of what Michael had documented in his journal. The sophisticated survival setup indicated they had indeed lived there for an extended period. The modifications to their equipment showed increasing skill and adaptation over time. But there were also signs that couldn't be easily explained by conventional wilderness survival scenarios. Dr. Walsh's preliminary analysis revealed that the campsite showed evidence of multiple occupants over an extended period, but not all the traces appeared to belong to Michael and Connor. Hair samples, fabric fragments, and tool marks suggested that others had used this location, both before and possibly after the Hartwells' occupation. The layering of evidence here is complex, Doctor, Walsh explained to the investigative team. This site has been used as a long-term habitation by multiple individuals or groups over a period of possibly decades. The Hartwell occupation represents just one chapter in a much longer story. Even more puzzling were the discoveries made in the surrounding area as the investigation expanded. Search teams found evidence of other camps, other long-term survival situations scattered throughout this remote region of the provincial forest. Some appeared to be much older than the Hartwell site, while others seemed more recent. The implications were staggering. This wasn't an isolated case of two people becoming lost and adapting to wilderness survival. This appeared to be part of a larger pattern of people disappearing into these mountains and establishing semi-permanent existence far from civilization. But why? And what had ultimately happened to them? The investigation was about to uncover answers that would challenge everything anyone thought they understood about the Canadian wilderness and the people who disappear into it. The truth about Michael and Connor Hartwell was more complex and more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The discovery of that hidden journal 15 years later proved that sometimes the wilderness holds secrets darker than we ever imagine. Michael and Connor Hartwell didn't simply vanish that September morning. They survived, adapted, and uncovered something in those mountains that defied explanation. Their story reminds us that the true mystery isn't always what happened to the missing, but what they found before they disappeared forever.